great. Couple announcements before we get to our program. Maybe I can break it for you, Stephanie. Don't worry, I'm good at that. Thank you for coming today. I can't thank you enough, and we've got a heck of a program today. Heck of a program. You look at all these things, those are iron bears, and you do iron in your home. Probably look better than they do. But anyway, Stephanie, Don gave a talk a couple of weeks ago. That's her other half. Stephanie's the better half, and she's going to talk today about the title over there. So we'll talk about that in just a second. The other thing is in 2 weeks we're going to have the old 10-man talk between their playing, and they're going to play a lot of war tunes, and they'll explain between the tunes what they're all about. So you'll learn a little bit about hymns that have evolved from war. Just think of taps that evolved from a little drummer boy doing taps in the Civil War. We use that in a lot of events and funerals and things. And a month from now, it'll be, I think, April 6th, the first Thursday of April, 6 days after April's Fool's Day, 9 days before you owe your taxes. Remember, Al Capone did pay his. We don't want you visiting his cell. I think it might have been in Alcatraz, maybe gone now. But anyway, April 6th, we have a guy named Zach Gable. And you probably know some Gables because they're about on the whole west side. His son is Mike Gable, and he's probably got 13 brothers and sisters. And so if you want to vote, if Gable would be on your side. Anyway, his son is was all city, all state, I think all American football player. So he's pretty tough, so don't take him on. But he's also a ranger, got military, I think 20 years experience, and a little bit of everywhere. But one of his duty stations was about a year or two in Washington, D.C., where he took care of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So we're going to have the ritual like we've had in the past, sponsored by the 48. 48's like the American Legion, it's like the VFW, but they've done it a year ago. We're going to do that for about 15 minutes, but then after that, or before that, Zach Gable will talk about the very prestigious thing of being a soldier at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. There's only been about 670 or so that have ever served there. It's very prestigious, very hard to be a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. If you wear that on your vest, you are really a very prestigious soldier. And they are in that group all their life. There's supposedly a man in Henderson that's 101. I hope if I can find him. He was the only Marine that was a guard of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier has been guarded from 1947 till now. Rain, weather, night, day, anything. So they've not skipped no matter what's going on. But that's about a month from now, 2 weeks from now, the band, and then we'll pass a hat around if they remember, just if you have any donations for keeping this going. The Bronstein Foundation supports that, so your steak lunch was from the Bronsteins. Now, it didn't taste like steak, that's somebody's fault. But I can't talk enough about Stephanie and Don. They showed up about a year ago or so. I could be wrong. I got their name wrong a bunch of times. With pictures like you pour water, and I call them everything. But her name is Stephanie Pictures. I got it right this time, Stephanie. But that car back there is one of only 148 cars or 42 cars ever made. It's called the command car. It's next to the yellow plane over there. And Don and Stephanie let us use it on display. There's only, they said one left is good condition like that, but I just left the World War II's in New Orleans, and they had one not looking as good as theirs. They're pretty nice, and so I think there's 2 functioning out of 142 made in the world. We got one of them here. But you look at all these artifacts. I mean, I don't know how many houses they own to keep all this stuff, but they're probably going to get a new garage pretty soon. Well, no more ado. This is Stephanie Pictures. You'll be amazed at what she has to say.
Good afternoon. Let's just do this, okay? So, as Mark said, my name is Stephanie Pitchers. For those of you that have asked before, Don is my husband, not my father. He's the trophy in the group. So anyway, I've been collecting this stuff for about 35 years. I got involved, I grew up in a perfect storm. I am the only one of my family that is from my generation, so I'm the only Gen X girl in the whole family. And I was the firstborn grandchild and great-grandchild and great-great-grandchild on both sides of the family. So all of the people that I grew up with were at least 20 years older than I am. And I grew up playing with the old 50s Barbie dolls and, you know, my great-aunt's Marine Corps uniforms from World War II were my dress-up clothes and things like that. So I just naturally became a nerd of all things old and cherished. So when I started doing things of women's history projects through Girl Scouts, through school, through things like that, you know, people wanted me to do more about the military, and certainly I've had family members that were in the military, but I didn't feel right because I never served and never intended to serve. So I started looking at civilian organizations and how they interacted with the military. And let me tell you, the Red Cross is probably one of the most convoluted and complex civilian organizations out there. Because not only do they run their own thing, but they have to work with the government, they have to work with the military, and all the other things, whereas a lot of the other organizations like the USO and all don't have that strict regulation. So that's what intrigued me, is all the working pieces and how they come together like a fine-tuned watch. So today we're going to focus a little more on what the Red Cross did in World War II, and a lot of people think it was just nursing, but it was way, way more than nursing. The Red Cross had multiple different subdivisions called corps of the Red Cross. So they were way more than nursing, and you know, there was a lot of other things that went on. And technical difficulties. Okay. So I don't know if we need to dim the light a little so you can see. So wherever we had soldiers and servicemen and servicewomen, we had the Red Cross. Prior to the U.S. involvement in World War II, the Red Cross also went over to very many countries like England and all and helped their Red Cross establish practices to help their soldiers. So here are some of the ideas of the insignia and some of the different corps of the Red Cross. You can always tell World War II Red Cross pins because they will have a white field around the Red Cross, but somewhere in that white field there will be some little symbol. You know, the motor corps is a green one that looks like a tire, and there's actually an air spoke for it. The administrative one has quills. The canteen corps, which, you know, you guys are all familiar with the canteens and how important they were in Evansville. They actually have railroad tracks behind the cross, and that was because so many of the soldiers came in through the railroad. These are just a couple of the different uniforms that you would see the ladies wearing. And, you know, again, a lot of these uniforms were actually made here in Evansville. So, you know, and they got shipped out all over the country. Each kind of branch had their own standard for uniforms, and each chapter kind of had their own little standard for uniforms. So it wasn't like there was one set group of rules, and there were a lot of different variations. You had a lot of ladies that served in World War I as volunteers and carried through the 20s, and so they would tend to wear older style uniforms, whereas the younger ladies wanted to be young and fresh and have that youthful look, so they wore the newer style uniforms. And the thing with the Red Cross is it didn't matter how old you were, they had something for you to do. So, you know, if you were in the school system, you got to participate in the penny a week fund, where they would encourage kids to bring in a penny each week, and that would go towards buying war bonds. The Junior Red Cross would often meet, and they would do sewing projects and little craft projects where it would be everything from making decorations for the canteen clubs to making toys for going over to Europe to children that were affected by the war. Gentlemen also served in the Red Cross. They were called field directors. The men and the women that went overseas were given an honorary rank of second lieutenant. And the reason being is that they were expected to behave as a fashion of an officer during their whole time of service. This also afforded them some of the luxuries to be able to get better supplies for the canteens and things. The men's uniforms were strictly what the Army issued. So whatever the Army officer's uniform was of the day, the men and the Red Cross wore the same thing, with the exception of the insignia, and then they changed out the buttons to Red Cross buttons, and then, of course, the hat badge. Here we have a picture of the production board. These were ladies and men that would do sewing, knitting, and all kinds of things. They made over 500 billion bandages in World War II. They did knitting. They set up sewing booths to help servicemen coming in that needed repairs on their uniforms. With the knitted goods, everything they did had an inspection process. They wore white so that it was kind of like a clean room situation, so that hair and things like that wouldn't get into garments. But everything was inspected and had to be uniform, so that if a parcel went out and it only had 3 sweaters, you might have 20 soldiers, but 3 of them would get sweaters and they would all be the same. And here's another one where they're making bandages. And again, these bandages went not just for our service, but they were sent to our allied nations as well for service for them. And here's a picture of a Red Cross nurse. And the nursing service did continue into World War II. It started in World War I, but after World War I, the Red Cross realized that they were going to have to gear up to do a lot more for the community than just nursing. They had already established the Navy Nurse Corps and the Army Nurse Corps and had gone to the military and said, now it's time for you to take over your own nursing corps. And the Army was like, okay, fine. The Navy was a little reluctant and said, well, it's not broke, so why do we need to fix it? But in the end, the Red Cross during World War II still continued to do all the training and all the recruiting for the military nurses. The Red Cross nurses that did serve during the war actually filled in gaps in the civilian hospitals. Some of them went into the military branches, and once they were there, they often got frustrated because they had too many people to report to for a chain of command. So a lot of times they would give up their Red Cross commission and just join the Army or the Navy. Another thing that is big with the Red Cross, and you guys are all aware of it because it was actually started here in Evansville, is the disaster relief. The disaster relief here, and not all Red Cross chapters around the country are created equal. Evansville probably has one of the best Red Cross organizations in the country to this day. When we have the tornadoes and flooding and stuff, the Red Cross mobilizes on a dime. And they always have. Here you have them, this is a flood in Cincinnati. And so you can see how they just go out and help wherever is needed. Same way with people that suffer from house fires and things like that. Again, the Junior Red Cross, they did their part, and these were kids from the age of 5 on up through high school. So you have thousands of kids that continue to contribute to the war and do their part as well. So nobody got left behind. POW parcels were another big thing, and we still continue, the Red Cross still continues to do this today, where they service prisoner of wars as well as prisoners that are unjustly kept in foreign countries, and serve as a liaison between families and governments, as well as getting them certain supplies and things like that. So when we talk about the prisoners over in Russia, things like that, you know, the Red Cross is somewhere in the background, you know, helping get supplies, helping get messaging, helping get whatever is needed to help get that transition and get those people home. The canteen service, we love the canteen. Wherever our soldiers were, the Red Cross was there. You know, whether it was Iceland or Alaska, over in China, Burma, India, we had canteens everywhere. And those canteens, again, it depended on the location. There were a lot of GIs that actually complained during World War II, saying that, you know, they could go to the USO and everything was free. But when they went to the Red Cross, there was a charge. There was a reason for that. And politics rears its ugly head and everything. So the British were actually had their own service clubs. And their soldiers and sailors had to pay for things at the club. Well, Churchill got wind that the British soldiers and sailors were complaining about the American soldiers and sailors. And he says, you know, you guys are over here, you get more money, you get better uniforms, you get better everything. And you don't have to pay a dime for anything. And it's not fair to our soldiers. So he actually went to the president and said, what can you do? And to save grace, the Red Cross started charging them the canteens. So it was about 5 cents. You would go into the canteen and you would get a sandwich, a bottle of Coke, and a dessert. And that was only when someone was actually watching the till. So it was suggested a lot, but it was enough to appease Churchill and to appease the British. In other areas, they didn't so much as enforce it. What they would do is they would give out paper chips that would be like little coupons that they would give out, and then the guys would turn in those coupons so that they could say, well, look, we got 200 coupons now, so we got 200 coupons that were 5 francs each, and so we made our money. You know, just to kind of play that political game. A lot of the canteens were not segregated, and especially like in the China, Burma, India theater and in the Pacific, the Red Cross actually kind of staged a mini coup where they said, you know, we cannot man and don't have enough manpower to do separate, segregated canteens. So they helped break down some of the race barriers that was very important at the time. And not that there was a lot of mixed troops during that time, but they saw the need to have those barriers broke down so that everyone could come in and be treated the same, have those bits of hospitality and those ties to home so that they could remember what they were fighting for and carry on about their day. And here's another picture of the canteen with the airmen. And this is the USS Enterprise behind them, and you can see some of the wounded sailors coming off to get coffee, you know, because I'm sure the ship coffee is not nearly as great as the stateside coffee. And again, wherever we went, you know, we had our men and women there providing touches of the home front. This is in Manila. And you can see some of the conditions. You know, you've got a tent, you set up a 2x4, and you know, you just did whatever you could to bring those touches of home to the soldiers. Here you have one of the ladies from the Clubmobile Division. The Clubmobile Division was an offshoot of the Military Welfare Division of the Red Cross. There were less than 500 of these women. They were specially trained to drive 2.5-ton trucks that were outfitted with donut makers and coffee machines. And so they would actually follow the guys in the front lines, and they would go around and have record players and magazines, cigarettes, candy bars, various other things, and be a mobile canteen service. And it was dangerous conditions. They often got shot at too. So, to look that cheery and have to go through some of those conditions, I don't know that I could do it. They had a burnout rate of about 4 months. So girls lasted about 4 months in that position, and then they would switch out and say, I just want to stay at one of the base canteens, so it's a little safer. And of course, they endured the same conditions that the men and women in our military services did. Sleeping in tents, washing their clothes out of garbage pails, hanging them to dry, doing all the things. So in a sense, they were a home front soldier that never got the recognition as much as our other fighting services. Here are ladies in India being shuttled out by a jeep to meet soldiers and take, in most cases, they took them donuts and coffee. And the donuts, they had a tendency to call them sinkers because depending on how hard they got fried up, they would definitely be a little tough and chewy. And so the guys would just plop them in the bottoms of their coffee cups to help sweeten the coffee. And said, well, if they sink, then we'll just have sponge cake at the end. And here's another Clubmobile lady. She's actually taking parcels, prisoner of war parcels, to French soldiers that were captured and liberated by the American troops. And that's another thing we don't think of, is that even though it's the American Red Cross, they treat everyone equally. And so many of the Red Crosses follow that national and international decree of treating people with humanitarian skills and dignity. So it doesn't matter who you were. You could have been a captured German, you could have been a captured Japanese. They would have tried to treat you just as well as they would have treated our own boys. Didn't necessarily mean that the person on the receiving end would be as kind and appreciative, but they did do their best. And that is the end of my slideshow, but I will tell you a little more about the Red Cross. It, again, did a lot of different things during the war. They had multiple branches. Some of the uniforms you see up here, all the things you see on the table are all original from my personal collection that I've been collecting for over 35 years. And to answer other questions, I've gotten it from everywhere. Flea markets are my friend. I like garage sales and estate sales. I've been fortunate to have some people give me things. But these are all original uniforms, which are really hard to come by because ladies were so ingenious when it came to recycling things. So they would often take their uniforms and they would turn them into civilian dresses and clothing. So you don't see a lot of women's uniforms of any type survive. So we have here a nice overseas uniform. This lady was actually served in the 15th Air Force in Italy. We have a Motor Corps uniform. The Motor Corps was, again, ingenious because these women had about 1,000 hours of training in mechanics as well as first aid. And so they would often do shuttle services between the bases and the train stations, the hospitals, things like that. They would ferry supplies for blood drives and whatnot. And then, of course, if there was it as well. The canteen service, these women were remarkable because we all think that you just volunteer and you show up and you make sandwiches. No, that wasn't the case with the Red Cross. The Red Cross actually had an entire coursework for canteen workers. It was over 1,000 hours of coursework that you had to do to be various levels of canteen service. This included food safety, refrigeration, sanitation. It even went down to the nitpickies of how to lay out a kitchen so that it was the most efficient way to service the most people coming through. So, and on top of that, they all had to be trained in first aid. So, you know, thousands and thousands of hours just before they even got to a point of being able to service people. Over here, the yellow uniform is actually an administrative assistant. Again, with the shortage of war and people going off to war, women going into the military services, filling needs in the factories and stuff, we had a shortage of administrative or type positions. So the Red Cross mobilized and had people that would go in and help with the factory administration, help with all the other things, hospital administration, those sorts of things. Arts and skills, that's a little known branch that actually helped with rehabilitation through art therapy. We think that the art therapy and some of the therapies that we see now are pretty new and innovative, but they're not. They came about because of the need from our war soldiers. So they would do painting, they would do modeling, and various other crafts and whatnot. And again, all of these men and women that served here on the home front did phenomenal things and never got a lot of recognition for it. So, you know, if you could imagine it, the Red Cross probably had a hand in it. So. Thank you. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask.
Wait till you get a microphone. You weren't allowed to send things directly to Germany. You had to send it to the Red Cross, I think, and they started sending it to Germany. Is that correct?
You are correct. So the question, if I understood it correctly, was that you, in order to send things to Germany, you had to go through the Red Cross. That was correct. We had censorship. So censorship was big on any of the parcels, any of the posts. With the POWs in particular, the Red Cross acted as a liaison between the family and the people that were prisoners in Germany, prisoners wherever, so that nothing would trip the system and get them in further trouble. So there was a whole list, and you know, I actually have some of the newsletters up here on the table that would be given to the families, saying, you know, what you could and couldn't do as far as communicating with your loved ones that were in the POW camps. But yes, everything did go through the Red Cross. You know, and the Red Cross did, you know, with the POWs, with the military. Even today, the Red Cross will take and help the military soldiers. Recently, my cousin, who's in the Navy, had a family emergency, and her family was stationed in Guam, and the Red Cross was the one that got her back here to the States. So, you know, it's one of those things that if you want to support the Red Cross, I always recommend that you look at supporting the military side of the Red Cross, you know, or the disaster recovery, because those things definitely go out to the communities and don't get used as much for administrative overhead.
During the war, did they primarily depend on local radio stations, newspapers, publicized the things that they would be involved with, or do they have a publicity operation in-house that you would do?
Okay, the question was, during the war, did they depend on the local radio and news stations to do publicity? They depended on some of it, but the Red Cross actually did have their own PR and publicity sort of machine. They actually had a lot of very famous journalists and artists and whatnot that would help with the Red Cross. Sports members also volunteered with the Red Cross to do things. For example, this Arts and Skills is actually named to a lady named Gertrude Schweister, and she's actually a famous artist from the New York area who's got art in the Metropolitan Museum of Art as well as the Getty Museum.
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Stephanie was saying by talking about what the Red Cross Canteen did here locally. They played a big role here during World War II, as you can see when you go through the community gallery here at the museum. She also mentioned segregation. The local USO was segregated. They had two separate buildings, one downtown and one on Lincoln for African Americans. The Red Cross Canteen that was at the corner of Fulton and Ohio Street was open to anyone, regardless of their race, and there was no charge. I'm assuming across the United States there was probably no charge.
Yeah, it was overseas that the charge.
In fact, you'll see letters on the walls from, and there are hundreds and hundreds of letters that the Red Cross got back from soldiers who went to this canteen and talked about the hospitality, the food, the service. They loved it, and that word got out all across the United States. So whenever anybody heard Evansville, they would talk about the Red Cross Canteen was here. And there's a letter on the wall in the community gallery from an African American who was on his way, he was a Tuskegee Airman, talking about the service they got here. Now, chances are he came in on the train, and the group he was with probably just went directly to the canteen and got back on the train, because had they gone into Evansville, the story probably would have been a little bit different, because the city here was very much segregated during World War II, except for the Red Cross Canteen.
My next question is, how long were you in the Red Cross? Did you have like a term limit? Like if you went in, you had to go for how much training and how long were you required to be there? Or you just come and go as please?
You came and went as you pleased. The trainings definitely were broke down by hours, and because of the war and the need, a lot of times they had various different times for trainings, much like today. In fact, this weekend at Deaconess, I believe, the Red Cross is doing a compression CPR thing that's free to the public, but it's broke down in hours. So you can sign up, and it's 1 hour increments. But what they would do is they would do a lot of mentoring for the people that didn't get through the training. But as far as service time, it was entirely up to you. There were people that went in, they served for a year. There were people that served for 20 years. There were people that served, longer. The overseas people, they typically wanted them to be 2-year contracts. However, again, because you were civilian, they couldn't really force you to it. None of the positions other than the overseas positions and some of the administrative positions here in the States were paid, so that they were just small amounts of pay when they went overseas.
What was the pay? That's my next question.
So it depended on where you were. The ladies got paid about $100 a month, and the men got paid about $150 a month.
American military had certain age ranges that they had in there. Did they have maximums and minimums for the American Red Cross too?
Yes, so for the ladies that went overseas, they all had to be 22 years old or older. And same way with the men. For the one stateside, again, as long as you were able-bodied, initially, early on in the war, you had to prove that U.S. citizenship. They dropped that after 1943. So if you were able-bodied and you were, I believe in the canteens, there's some records of people being as young as 13 years old working in the canteen stateside. Some of the other branches of corps of the Red Cross, like the Motor Corps, you had to be a little older because you had to be able to drive. But again, there were thousands of school-age kids that did things for the Red Cross too. And a lot of the Red Cross did double duty. So you would see ladies that would be at the production corps doing the sewing and making bandages, and then they would have a couple hours off or have a day off, and they would go and serve in the canteen too. And that wasn't uncommon. A lot of the factories also brought in Red Cross and had their own canteen services, and they had their own little production corps areas where factory workers, when they were off, they could take their breaks and go and help and make bandages or whatever the case was that the Red Cross was working on at that time.
Did they have a maximum age? You know how the military during World War II?
No, there was no maximum age.
Okay, that's what I wanted to.
I want to add something that the Red Cross did to what Stephanie's been talking. When my dad was in the Army during World War II, he was stationed in California, and his father passed away. The family got a hold of the Red Cross, who got a hold of his unit in California, who didn't want to let him come home, but the Red Cross managed to convince him to do that. He hitchhiked all the way across the U.S. to Evansville to get here. But anyway, the Red Cross helped him out a lot there.
I've got somebody with a microphone already down here. Go ahead.
You mentioned the partying aiders. The thing behind that was in World War I, the trains in Europe would hold either 40 men or 8 mules.
My name is Linda Boland, and my father was in charge of the Army Map Service during the war, and he told me that they secreted escape maps to the prisoner of wars through the Red Cross packages. I don't know if anyone else has heard this story, but apparently there were maybe 15 different ways that they secreted maps into those boxes. One was in the cardboard, one was hiding the map in a Monopoly game piece, another was in decks of cards, and they produced very detailed maps, kind of like the silk maps that we saw last week. But I've never actually seen the artifact, but I've heard about it from my dad, so I know it's a true story.
That's correct. Although they weren't supposed to and could have gotten in really big trouble, and that's common with a lot of the services. So the maps would often be coded, and it was something that was trained before soldiers got to be to a prisoner. These were things that they learned in basic. So it was basic map skills, and they knew just by looking at the things what they were looking at. And yeah, they would be in the cardboard, they would be in the interior of the box of the playing cards, so that when they tore the box apart, and oftentimes it wouldn't just be a whole map, but it would be a piece. So, you know, you might have 4 parcels going in, and you might have, like in the Stalag over in Germany, you might have to get 4 different groups of prisoners together to get one whole map.
Did the Red Cross do anything for the survivors at the death camps when they were liberated or before?
Yes, the Red Cross did do, they were actually on hand to provide help with medical services. Another thing that they did is also help with the psychological warfare of that. When our soldiers went in to liberate the death camps, they were astounded. Like they just didn't understand what they were seeing or how humanity could be so cruel. And for the people that were in those camps, you know, a lot of them had been starving, and so they initially gave them food, and which made them very sick because they ate too much and then got sick. So the Red Cross was there and helped with medical, helped with some of the psychological, helped get word back to families that yes, you have a surviving person here, and helped rehabilitation with those. Not just from the survivors, but also from the people that liberated them, because that took a mental toll on them. Any other questions?
Stephanie, I've always been curious as to what percentage of those POW packages actually made it into the hands of the POWs in World War II. Is there any information on that from liberated POWs?
The actual, if you can get a hold of the actual POW newsletters, which I have a couple of them, do give a percentage of the ones that went overseas and where they went. It's very hard because in the 80s, the National Red Cross did a big sell-off of a lot of their archival material. So a lot of the history was lost. And I am in no way, shape, or form affiliated with the Red Cross. I just love the history of it. So I was fortunate enough to see a value in buying some of the stuff that they were selling off at the time. And I've come across it through other means over the years. And that is one of the things that I haven't really delved in a lot, because I want to make sure that when I do that I give both the Red Cross the what it's due, as well as the POWs, what they're due in terms of remembering them. But aside from the Red Cross parcels that went for the POWs, very similar parcels were also sent all over war-torn countries, and those would be food parcels, clothing parcels, parcels with toys, so that, you know, when kids were in bombed out Europe, they would have those little things to kind of rebuild their lives.
This is sort of a related question. Do you know how successful Red Cross was in getting into North Vietnam to the POW camp?
That I don't know. I know that the Red Cross during the Vietnam War, the donut dollies in particular were very well loved. And these were ladies, again, you know, the term donut dolly started in World War II. It actually goes back a little further to World War I. But Vietnam, those ladies went through a lot, and they were right there with the front lines, giving those little bits of hospitality. But as far as the POWs go, I'm not sure how successful they were. Vietnam was a very, very different war than World War II, and you know, a lot worse in many cases.
Stephanie, were there volunteer nurses in the Red Cross, or did you have to be a member?
So the question is, were there volunteer nurses in the Red Cross? The answer is yes. Nurses were a little bit of a different breed during World War II. You know, there was such a shortage of nurses that the nurses were actually paid, and I don't know what the pay scale was, because it depended on whether you were in a civilian hospital or a VA system or with the military. But the Red Cross actually took and they recruited for all of the military nursing services. They did training. They actually helped with the Cadet Nurse Corps, which was a program that took high school girls and taught them nursing. And basically, after 2 years, it was kind of like a speedy sort of education thing where, you know, after 2 years of training and you were already in the hospital system, you got placed in job placement and you got your degree for nursing. The Red Cross also did all of the first aid and the swimming safety, water safety for the military, and they still do that today. Before any of the troops deployed overseas, especially if they were going by boat, they had to do a swimming test, and the Red Cross was the one that did that. The Red Cross was the one that set up all the first aid guidelines for the military, and that came from both their nurses, their doctors, and those sorts of things. And again, with the nurses in particular, they tried to use the Red Cross nurses mainly stateside, but they would go into the military branches and be an offshoot of that. But again, most of those, especially if they went overseas, got a little frustrated with having to report to the military as well as back home to the Red Cross. And I even have in one of my collections a letter from a nurse that goes back and forth where she's trying to contact her Red Cross director. And she's talking about supplies she needs for uniforms and things. And the director sends her back and says, well, you're with the Army now. You need to go to your Army commander that you're with. And they're like, I have. You know, they tell me to go to the Red Cross. So then the next letter comes back and she says, I resigned my commission and I'm joining the Army.
Well, Stephanie, thank you very much for a very important. Oh, we have another question.
One there, one over there. My question is, when you have a local disaster, like a tornado or what happened in Owensboro many years ago, I was on state active duty out of Henderson, out of the local National Guard unit, my second time in. But how does that command structure work? Is it Homeland Security now, then FEMA, then Red Cross? Because there was a great relationship between the Red Cross and FEMA, what I saw in Owensboro when I was over there for 3 days.
I wish I had better information on that, but I'm not really sure how that works. I do know, again, the Red Cross is very different in different communities. The disaster relief organization here in Evansville actually started back in the teens with the flooding that you guys had, and I'm not an Evansville native, so don't quiz me on that history. And the disaster relief group here is one of the largest in the country. So they have the most resources, they have the most vehicles, and you know they can mobilize within 24 hours to go just about anywhere. Same way with their blood collection services here. You know, we're really lucky to have such a well fine-tuned organization. When people, you know, when they had the house explosions on Weinbach, you know, the Red Cross was there helping those people. And again, less than 24 hours, they were there. So I'm not sure how they mobilize or what resources they get, but I'm really glad that they have all those resources.
I have a question for you and maybe others in the room. And it's been probably 75 years ago that I did this. And I attended Lutheran grade school. But I remember we used to pack care boxes, C-A-R-E. And I don't know, does anybody remember doing that? George? They're C-A-R-E boxes, small boxes. I guess we put toothpaste, toothbrushes, and stuff like that. Didn't even send them overseas. But I have no idea what the destination is.
So the Care Box program started in World War II, and again, that was mainly geared for children. And it was supposed to be for children affected by devastation, whether it be war-torn countries, or, you know, in more modern times, it was probably for food insecurity and poverty sort of situations. And again, those would be like little toiletry articles, maybe some crayons, maybe a set of jacks or some toys that were kind of universal that didn't have to have any kind of explanation, but would transcend, you know, every age group.
Where did the money come from for the canteens, with food and all that?
The question is, where did the money come from for the canteens, for the food and everything? Some of it was government, depending on where the location was again. But most of it was actually donation. You had a lot of corporations, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, they were very big in supplying sodas for the canteens, both here and abroad. They would ship thousands and thousands of cases of sodas overseas. You know, as far as food goes, especially overseas, it was the local economy. One of the other missions of the Red Cross during World War II was to help boost the local economy they were in. You don't hear it so much in Europe, but in places like New Zealand and Australia that were penal colonies prior to the war and had some very rough areas and some sketchy areas, you would often hear stories of the Red Cross going into a town, going to the local saloons, telling the ladies, you're going to take a couple weeks vacation, you're going to clean up your act, and you're going to come back and you're going to help us run the canteens. And they would completely turn these ruffian towns around to places that were desirable to live because this was where all the American soldiers were coming in. And now it almost created, like Evansville, created a little bit of a boom town where people wanted to be. So, yeah, not only did they help with the moral on the home front, but they helped with the moral overseas.
In the local Red Cross here in Evansville here in World War II, the food was donated by the community, the churches, the housewives, the farmers. You never knew what the menu was going to be from day to day because it was all donated. In fact, there are stories about kids who donated their own birthday cakes to the soldiers here locally.
If there aren't any more questions, I'll take you back and encourage you to come up and